My name is Margaret. It should really be Margarita Kandkroon. I was born in Utrecht, a big city in Holland, and spent most of my younger years in The Hague, which is also a very big city in Holland. And from there we migrated. I migrated with my parents and my three sisters and a brother that was born here. In '57 we came out. Originally we were supposed to migrate to America, but it was a lot harder to get into. My father had to have a sponsor, which he did have, but then my mother became pregnant with my brother and they had to wait to get back into America. So friends of ours had migrated already before us and they settled in Geelong, and they said, why don't you've got everything ready, come to Australia, it's beautiful here, and we'll help you get a house or a roof over your head. So we moved in with a family of 12 children, and mum and dad, and then us 6. And we lived in East Geelong for about 7 weeks, and then found a little house in Separation Street. It belonged to Adams the Plasterers. It had 2 tiny little bedrooms, just a kitchen, and that's where we lived. My mum was in hospital at the time, had no windows. I can remember going with my dad, fixed up all the broken windows, cleaned the little bathroom that had a bath and a boiler, and repaired little windows. And my mum ended up in hospital while she had the baby. She was doing hand sewing, little curtains. So that's how we started, by coming to Geelong. I had just left school. I was very, very upset with my parents because you're at a teenage stage. I was nearly 14. And having to just be taken away from your aunties, your cousins, your friends, school, to not knowing what's going to happen, where you end up, a whole new country. And I was really, really cross with them because it was just, you're being taken away. But in hindsight, what we didn't realise, my parents were struggling because it was after the war. Part of The Hague, the place where I come from, was bombed down in Holland. So we lived in a very tiny little, you can imagine it a little bit like, they have the commission flats in Footscray, and they were, say, 5, 6 stories high. And of course, we as younger children, I was the eldest, and as younger children, we had older people living downstairs because they didn't have to climb the stairs, so the commission looked after the elderly downstairs. And the neighbours were forever telling us kids to stop running around and be quiet, and there was the country started picking up a little bit after the war. So things were like, for my parents it was very hard. I mean, if quite often my parents would go to the op shop to buy myself some shoes and things like that because they did it tough. And then that's why they decided to migrate, because at that time there was no option of getting a bigger house for the children. It wasn't available. So in hindsight now, yes, they did the right thing. But as a child, you don't see what your parents go through, you know, what they have to sacrifice. And it was just a big sacrifice for them as well, because I can remember my father, he was the big one that said, yeah, we'll migrate, it was fantastic, you know, it'll be all right, because they show you lots of movies, what to expect, you know. And I know he would walk from Separation Street to where the abattoirs were in North Geelong and watch the ships coming in, and he'd be bawling his eyes out because he was homesick. When my mum was growing up, she grew up in a very big family, like there was 16 of them. And my father came from a big family, but my mum used to tell us stories from way back. She lost her mum at an early age, and they sort of, the baby at the time, I think, was about 3 years of age when my grandmother died. So there's 16 kids. So the bigger ones sort of helped to raise the smaller ones, and my grandfather, being a gardener, he would not always be home early and made the most of the summer months when there was longer daylight. And she would tell us about the tradition that when she first went to work, they all worked outside in houses, like living in, boarding, and then they would come home she'd have a Wednesday afternoon off, and they would walk back home to their mums, and they would pay their board, and then in return she would get her rum bean chocolates, and she'd take that back as a treat. But even though they weren't living at home, they were still coming back home to pay. And then as they went out of a night time, the bigger boys, they would organise to meet the girls, because the girls were up to no good, so were the boys, of course, in their teen years. And how my grandfather sometimes was awake up to it, and my mum always said that when she came home one night, father was waiting behind the door, and she'd bought this brand new blouse. So, and of course, in those days, she did get a hiding and a half. You know, her stories were just sort of up to the tricks that the boys got up to. If they had their nice white outfit to go and play tennis, the other ones would be upstairs with a bucket of cow shit, and turn it upside down. And they were real, yeah. Or they would go to the butcher's and they'd say, "Oh, have you still got any pork legs?" And yeah, the butcher'd say, "Yeah." And he'd say, "Oh, well, it'd be awkward to walk on, wouldn't it?" You know, like really, and opening up the taps off the milk carts, stuff like that. So, you know, they are stories that my sisters want to know. Because, again, like I said, there was so much age difference. And, of course, my younger sister, I think, was about 30 when Mum died. So she hasn't had that lot of history.